you for joining us for our annual R. Wayne Kraft Memorial Lecture on the general subject area of Christian humanism, which of course is what we are all about here at DeSales University. For those of you who may not have had the pleasure of knowing him, Wayne Kraft was a renowned metallurgist at Lehigh University, held numerous patents in the field. But what he was especially passionate about was philosophy. Teilhard de Chardin. And so after teaching all of the scientists at Lehigh about metals, he would come over here and teach students at what was then Allentown College about Teilhard de Chardin. Science, philosophy, it was a beautiful marriage of what Christian humanism is about. That love of learning in various fields. And in addition, Wayne Kraft was also a member of the very first class of permanent deacons in the Diocese of Allentown. So you've got faith, you've got science, and you've got philosophy. If only he had been a Phillies fan, it would have been a perfect fit. But we are especially grateful to Wayne Kraft's family, many of whom are here with us this evening, for sponsoring this lecture series, which we put on every year. And we're especially delighted to have as our speaker someone who also looks at the question of religion and faith and culture, particularly in contemporary society. It fits in perfectly with the theme of Christian humanism, with what we're about here at DeSales University, with what St. Francis de Sales was about, what R. Wayne Kraft is about. So please join me in welcoming Professor Christian Smith.
So, Catholic Emerging Adults in the Future of Humanism. The NSYR, by the way, in the top of all these slides is the National Study of Youth and Religion, which was just alluded to. I'm not going to tell you about them. I'm going to tell you about our methodology and data and so on. And just take for granted I've been studying this a long time, and I have some reason to know what I'm talking about. In my presentation here, I'm referring to something like cultures that place particular values on the distinctive personhood and dignity of all human beings, not just some human beings, that recognize the moral significance and responsibility of human actions, that carefully encourage what is good and noble and discourage what is regrettable and destructive in humanity, and that construct social institutions like schools and theaters and museums and all sorts of social institutions that reflect, respect, and enhance human life understood in such terms. So that's what I'm going to mean here by humanism, roughly. And I bring this up because this, to me, is one of a bazillion examples we could give of what it looks like to live in a humanistic society, or a society where humans, every last human is valued. Not just the brightest and the most beautiful and the most capable, but those who, for whatever reason, even their own faults of their own and everyone, whatever reason, doesn't have a place to live, is in need and so on. So in a humanist society, every last person is attended to, at least ideally. And so this is a case that's being worked out here in Allentown, a whole variety of partners, including DeSales. In the long run, sustaining robust humanism will depend in part on sustaining its robust justifications in Judaism and Christianity, especially Catholicism. That more or less follows if you apply all my first 9 theses. That's the first part. That's just framing what I have to say next. The second part is American Catholicism faltering. So basically here I am a bearer of quite bad news as a sociologist, which I'm sorry to have to be, but the news is bad and it has to be said and confronted. Numerous signs of weakening Catholicism in the U.S., especially among youth, raise concerns about American Catholicism's future. And again, all this is set in the context of sustaining humanism will require sustaining a robust Catholic Church faith tradition. So, first, Catholic youth exit their teenage years the sociologically weakest among U.S. Christian faiths. So the arrow on the left is pointing at religious service attendance. I'm not going to walk you step by step through the numbers, but the bottom line here is if you compare conservative Protestants, that's CP, mainline Protestants, black Protestants, Roman Catholics, Mormons, etc., consistently Catholic teenagers, here we're talking about the 13 to 17-year-old, are the weakest Catholics like to specialize, actually, in the day-to-day Catholic youth like to specialize in sort of in the middle, in the somewhat area. They're not in the high, intense, committed, serious range, and they're not in the totally bail out, I don't care about this at all. They sort of gravitate toward the, I feel somewhat close to God, sort of gravitate to a middle to lower middle range here. So they attend church less than any other Christian group. Importance of faith, they're lower on, again, this is 13 to 17-year-olds, how close they feel to God. Again, somewhat close, 43% tend to gravitate there. So that's the first point. I'm just going to run through a bunch of points, all of which essentially is different kinds of data to make the same underlying point, and that is the Catholic Church is losing a huge proportion of its young people, and that has pretentious implications for the future. Second, this is a little harder to read, but I'll try to explain it a little bit. Catholic youth decline religiously from their teenage to their college age years more than non-Catholic youth. So basically, it's common across every religious tradition that from the teenage years to the 20s, there's a dip or a decline in how religious people who grew up in that tradition are. But the dip or the decline is stronger among Catholics. If the logic of everything I said in part one was true, if by the time we have great-grandchildren, we want there to be a world in which Catholicism, and therefore Catholic social teachings, are strong, robust, taught, convinced, understood, and acted upon. The more the Catholic Church is weakened, and these people don't have commitment and so on, the less that's going to be that world, and the more humanism will be vulnerable to being replaced by subhumanisms, even barbarism. I hate to say that. My first recommendation would be to balance what happened in the 60s through the 80s, a movement in Catholic higher education to improve mainstream quality and integration, with a renewed Catholic distinctiveness today. And that is, Catholic higher education went through a fairly longish phase where the perception was, we're not as good as this, the secular and the Protestant world. We're sort of behind, quality of our education isn't good, so we need to catch up. We need to get more impressive, we need to strengthen, we need to replace some of our philosophical approaches, we need to get more integrated into the mainstream world of higher education. And I won't say that was good or bad, but I would say one of the unintended, and perhaps some people say intended consequences, but it had a secularizing effect on college education. Catholic colleges and universities just looked less Catholic than they were as a result of trying to become more mainstream, normative, and acceptable. And if that's true, there needs to be a kind of a pendulum swing back to a greater balance where Catholic colleges recapture the distinctiveness of being Catholic. We're not trying to be like everybody else, and we don't even necessarily have to live up to everyone else's standards. We can define our own standards, and we're distinctively what we are.